The flour was cold against Sarah Blaine's palms, cold and gritty in a way that made her think of every kitchen she had ever stood in, and every morning she had ever begun alone. She worked it slowly, pressing her knuckles into the dough on the boarding house table, listening to the wind off the Nevada flats push hard against the shuttered window. It was November of 1889, and the town of Caldera was the color of old bone, pale dust, pale sky, pale people who had said their piece about her and moved on. She had heard the piece, they said, every word of it. Too plain, some offered, as though plainness were a verdict a woman must accept from strangers. Too quiet, too long without a husband, which meant, in the logic of a small frontier town, that something must be broken in her. She was 28 years old, the boarding house cook and laundress, and she had lived in Caldera for 3 years without anyone offering her more than a polite nod after Sunday service. The women who might have been friends had decided early that Sarah Blaine was not their kind of woman, and the men who might have called on her had taken one long look and found a reason to look elsewhere. She was not beautiful in the way the town preferred. She was tall and angular, with hands roughened to leather by lye soap and well water, and a face that was honest rather than soft. She did not blush prettily or laugh at the right moments. She said what she meant and was silent when she had nothing to say, which unnerved people more than rudeness would have. She had stopped minding most of it. What she had not stopped minding was the cold at the center of her days, the particular cold that had nothing to do with November. She pressed her knuckles into the dough again and let the work fill the quiet, the way she always did. Before that winter was out, a child not yet 4 years old would look up at her with absolute certainty and call her something the whole town of Caldera had never thought to try. Sarah did not know that yet. She only knew the cold, and the flour, and the wind at the window. Then someone knocked at the back door. The knock was not polite. It was the knock of a man who needed something badly enough to show up at a stranger's back door in the gray hour before dawn, and Sarah Blaine, who had cooked for hungry men long enough to recognize desperation by its sound, wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer it. The man on the step was broad-shouldered and trail-worn, holding a small girl against his chest, the way a man holds the one thing in his life he is absolutely certain about. The girl was asleep, or nearly so, her dark curls tucked under a wool hat that was too large for her head. Her small fist closed tight around the lapel of the man's coat, as though she had decided some time ago that she would not be set down. He said, "I was told you hire out. Cooking and washing." Sarah looked at him steadily. "I work for the boarding house." "I know it," he said. "I need someone who can work a ranch kitchen. Mine, 7 miles out, near the old Harlan claim." "I'm not interested in ranch work," she said. He didn't argue. He just shifted the child a little higher on his chest and said, "The girl needs regular meals, and someone to mind her while I work the cattle. She's had neither since her mother passed, and I don't know how much longer I can keep doing half a job of it." Sarah looked at the child again. The small fist still clutched the coat lapel. Even in sleep, the girl held on. "What happened to her mother?" Sarah asked. "Fever," he said, 8 months ago. He said it the way a man says the thing he has said too many times. All the grief worn smooth by repetition into something that looked almost like calm. "My name is Amos Holt. The girl is Clara." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. The wind pushed at the eaves above them. She thought about the boarding house kitchen and the cold at the center of her days, and she thought about the small fist on the coat lapel. "Come in," she said. "I'll hear what you're offering." He stepped inside, and the child stirred against his chest, turned her face toward the warmth of the kitchen, and made a small sound that was not quite a word. Amos Holt sat down at the table and laid out what he had: a ranch with a working cattle operation and a 3-room house, a wage of $12 a month and board, and a daughter who had not eaten a proper meal since he brought her home from his sister's care 2 weeks ago because his sister had taken ill herself and could no longer manage it. "She won't eat for me," he said, looking down at the child. He said it quietly, and the shame in it was plain. "She ate for my sister. She's 3 years old, and she won't eat, and I don't know what I'm doing wrong." Sarah had cooked for men with pride and men with grief, and she had learned that grief wore pride like a coat to keep the cold out. She understood what it cost him to say that. "She might eat something sweet," Sarah said, "or something warm she can hold in her hands. Small children don't always want what adults think they ought to want." Amos Holt looked up at her. "You know children," he said. It was not a question. "I know hunger," she said, "in people of all sizes." Clara stirred then, opened her eyes, and looked directly at Sarah with the uncomplicated directness that small children use before they learn to be cautious. She had her father's dark eyes and a crease on her cheek from the wool of his coat. She looked at Sarah for a long moment, and then she reached out one hand toward the bread dough still sitting on the table. "Soft," she said. Sarah tore off a small piece and held it out. Clara took it and put it in her mouth. Amos watched this happen and said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. $12 a month, your own room, all your meals." 14, Sarah said. He nodded without hesitation. 14. Sarah folded her hands on the table. "I'll need Sundays." "You'll have them, and I won't be spoken to like a hired hand in front of the child. Whatever arrangement we have, in front of Clara, I am a person, not a convenience." Something shifted in his face. It was not offense. It was closer to respect, which was rarer and therefore more startling. "That's fair," he said. She gave him her answer and her notice to the boarding house in the same morning. They left for the Holt place on a Thursday in a wagon that smelled of pine resin and cold leather. Clara sat between them on the bench, wrapped in a quilt, and pointed at things along the road with the solemn authority of a very small explorer. A hawk, a dry creek bed, a stand of juniper. She named what she knew and invented names for what she didn't, and Sarah listened to every word with the attentiveness of someone receiving important information. Amos drove and said little. That did not surprise her. He was a quiet man in the way that some men are quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have learned that saying it costs something they can't always afford. The house was plainer than he had described it. 3 rooms as promised, but the kitchen was cold and the larder was close to empty, and the small bedroom meant for her had a cot with a mattress that had seen better days and a window with a broken latch that let in the November air. She looked at all of it without expression. Clara took her hand. The child had done it without preamble, simply reached up and wrapped her fingers around Sarah's 2 forefingers, the way children do when they have decided the matter is settled. Sarah looked down at her. "Come see my room," Clara said. She let herself be led. Clara's room was warmer than the rest of the house because Amos had put a second stove grate in the wall between it and the main room. There was a wooden horse on the windowsill and a small chair that someone had painted blue. Clara walked to the chair and sat in it with great dignity, and looked at Sarah as though she had just shown her something worth seeing. "Papa made it," she said. Sarah looked at the chair. The joints were careful. The paint was even. Someone had taken considerable time on it. "He made it well," she said. Clara nodded, satisfied. "You can sit in the big chair," she said, pointing at the rocker by the window. Sarah sat. It was the first time in a long while that she had been offered a seat by anyone who meant it kindly. She sat in the rocking chair in the small girl's room while the Nevada wind pressed against the glass, and she did not let herself think too hard about how right it felt, because she was a practical woman and she had made a practical bargain, and she was not going to mistake warmth for something more than what it was. But she did look at the blue chair. And she did notice that whoever had made it had also made it exactly the right size. She fixed the larder problem in 4 days. She had come with her own stores: dried beans, a sack of cornmeal, salt pork, a tin of molasses, because she had looked at Amos Holt and made a reasonable guess about the state of his provisions. She cooked in the mornings while Clara sat on the kitchen floor with a wooden spoon and a tin cup and conducted private experiments in sound, and she set a proper plate at the table 3 times a day because a child that age needed the ritual of meals as much as the food itself. Clara ate. She ate everything Sarah put in front of her, slowly and seriously, with the concentration of a small person who has recently rediscovered that food is a reliable pleasure. Amos watched this from across the table with an expression Sarah did not examine too carefully, because it was the expression of a man who has been frightened for a long time and has just been given a reason to breathe. He thanked her on the 5th morning, standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands. "She ate 2 helpings last night," he said. "I know," Sarah said. "I was there." He almost smiled. It was a brief thing, quickly folded away, but she saw it. The work itself was not hard for a woman who had worked hard all her life. The house was large enough to keep her occupied and small enough to feel manageable. She repaired the broken window latch herself, with a nail and a piece of wire she found in the barn. She banked the fire properly at night so the kitchen was warm when she rose at 5 to start breakfast. She washed and mended and kept the larder stocked from the town supply wagon that came on Tuesdays, paying for provisions from the household account Amos had given her access to without ceremony, as though trust were a practical matter and not a gift. It was, she supposed, both. What she had not expected was the loneliness of the work, which was different from the loneliness of the boarding house. At the boarding house, loneliness was the absence of people. Here, there were people, and the loneliness came from their careful distance. Amos was courteous and present at meals, and gone the rest of the time. He was not cold. He was simply a man who had built walls after his wife died, and he lived inside them with the efficiency of someone who has decided that walls are better than weather. Clara, though, had no interest in distance. Clara followed Sarah from room to room with the persistence of someone who has recently acquired something she is not willing to lose. She sat on the kitchen floor while Sarah cooked. She handed Sarah clothespins from the basket when the washing went up on the line. She fell asleep sometimes in the afternoon, wedged against Sarah's side on the bench by the window, one fist still curled, still holding on. Sarah was careful with herself about it. She was careful not to let it mean too much, because Clara was not hers, and the bargain was a working arrangement, and $14 a month was not the same thing as a family. She was careful. She was not always successful. The morning the trouble came, it arrived the way trouble usually does in a small town, on the back of someone else's opinion, delivered with perfect confidence in its own authority. Mrs. Eugenia Pratt, who ran the dry goods store in Caldera and considered herself the custodian of the town's good name, arrived at the Holt Ranch on a Tuesday with 2 women from the Ladies' Aid Society and a look on her face that was all charity on the surface and something much harder underneath. Sarah answered the door. She recognized Mrs. Pratt by reputation and said nothing beyond good morning, which she said evenly and without warmth. Mrs. Pratt looked past her into the house. "We've come to call on Mr. Holt," she said, "and to look in on the child." The "and" to look in on the child had the character of a second sentence that was actually the first one. "Mr. Holt is out with the cattle," Sarah said. "Clara is napping." "We'll wait," said Mrs. Pratt. Sarah let them in because it was the right thing to do, and because she was not a woman who created scenes, but she made them tea from the second-best tin and offered them nothing from the larder, which was her quiet way of making her feelings known without speaking them aloud. They waited, They looked at everything with the particular thoroughness of women who are cataloging rather than visiting. One of them, a thin woman named Mrs. Aldous, remarked on the tidiness of the kitchen with a tone that made tidiness sound like evidence of something. "It must be a comfort to Mr. Holt," Mrs. Pratt said finally, "to have a woman from town helping out. Temporary, of course." "Of course," Sarah said, and let the silence after it do its work. Mrs. Pratt tried again. "It's only that the arrangement has people talking. A single man and a single woman, living on the same property. People worry about appearances." Sarah looked at her with the same steady look she had offered at the boarding house door to Amos Holt in the dark November morning, the same look she offered every person who came to her with a verdict they were confident in. "I appreciate the concern," she said. "Clara appreciates a hot meal and someone who mends her stockings. I expect those things are more useful than appearances." The thin woman's lips pressed together. Mrs. Pratt opened her mouth. The back door opened. Amos came in, still wearing his coat, tracked mud on the kitchen floor Sarah had swept that morning, looked at the three women at his kitchen table with the careful blankness of a man taking stock of a situation, and said, "Mrs. Pratt." "Mr. Holt." She shifted, gathering herself. "We were just expressing our concern about the nature of your current domestic arrangement. The town feels—" "The town," Amos said, "is welcome to its feelings." He set his hat on the peg by the door. He did not raise his voice. He had, Sarah was beginning to understand, no need to raise his voice. He simply said things in a way that made other things unnecessary. "Miss Blaine is employed on this property, and she has conducted herself with more decency than I've seen from most of the people who've been talking about her. I'd be grateful if you passed that along." Mrs. Pratt stood. Her companions stood. "They left the way people leave when they have not gotten what they came for and cannot admit it, which is to say, with great dignity and very quickly." After the door closed, the kitchen was quiet. Clara's voice drifted from the back room, talking to her wooden horse, which was its own kind of reassurance. Sarah poured the remaining tea down the sink. She kept her back to Amos for a moment, not because she was upset, but because she needed a moment with the feeling that had come over her when he spoke, the feeling of being defended, which was not something she had a great deal of experience with. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes," he said, "I did." She turned then. He was still standing by the door, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the careful distance or the worn smooth grief, but something unguarded, something that had been there a while and had not known, until this moment, that it could be seen. He looked away first. "Clara will want her afternoon biscuit," he said. "I know," said Sarah. "I was about to make them." He nodded and went back out the door, and Sarah turned to the stove, and the kitchen held them both, even in the absence of both of them, the warmth of it real and quiet and doing its slow, patient work. That evening, Amos did not go to his chair in the main room after supper the way he usually did. He sat at the kitchen table while Clara climbed onto Sarah's lap with a picture book she could not yet read and demanded that Sarah make up what the words said, which Sarah did, inventing a story about a hawk and a dry creek and a stand of juniper that made Clara laugh until she hiccuped. Amos watched. He had a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, and he did not drink it. He was watching the two of them, and his face was open, in a way that Sarah understood, after a moment, was not accidental. He was letting her see it. He had decided, or was in the process of deciding, something, and he was letting her see the deciding of it, which was its own kind of statement from a man who did not make statements lightly. She finished the story. Clara asked for another. Sarah gave her a shorter one, and when it was done she said it was time for bed, and Clara went without argument, which was unusual, and Sarah thought it might be because the child could feel the particular quality of the evening, and understood, in the wordless way of small children, that something was happening that was important to let happen. She came back to the kitchen. Amos was still there. He said, without looking up from the table, "I've been thinking." "I know," she said. He looked up. She sat down across from him, which she had not done before. She had always sat at the end of the table, the hired woman's position, leaving the head to him. She sat across from him now and put her hands flat on the table and waited. He said, "This arrangement we have, it's working." "It is," she said. "Clara," he stopped, started again. "Clara hasn't been herself since Ellen died. She stopped talking for 2 months. She started again when you came." He was looking at the table, then he looked at her. "She calls you something when she talks to her horse. I heard her." Sarah had heard it too and had not known what to do with it. She waited. "She calls you Mama," Amos said. "She knows you're not. I've talked to her about it," she says, and here something in his voice shifted, became rough at the edges in a way that she understood was the grief under the calm. "She says you're what a mama does, that it's what you do that makes it." Sarah sat with that for a moment. The fire in the stove ticked softly. Outside, the Nevada wind had gone still, the first still night since she had arrived, and the silence it left was large and full. "She's right," Sarah said quietly. "About what makes it." Amos looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "I'm not a man who knows how to say things the right way. I never was, even before. But I know what this house felt like before you came, and I know what it feels like now, and I know which one Clara deserves to live in for the rest of her growing up." Sarah's hands were still flat on the table. She did not move them. "I'm asking you," he said, "if you'd be willing to make this permanent, not as a hired woman, as—" He stopped. The word cost him something to say, and he said it plainly, the way he said everything, "as my wife. As Clara's mother, if you'd have her." The fire ticked. Sarah looked at him, at his hands on the table, broad and roughened by the same kind of work that had roughened hers, and she thought about the blue chair and the careful joints and the window latch she had fixed herself and all the small acts between two people that had been building, without either of them saying so, into something that had the shape of a life. "I'm not beautiful," she said. "The town has made its opinion plain." "I know what the town says," Amos said. "The town never made my daughter laugh until she hiccuped." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest that had been held tight for a long time, longer than she had admitted even to herself, long enough that she had forgotten it was held. "Yes," she said. He exhaled slowly, and in it was everything he had been carrying. "Yes," he repeated, as though making sure of it. "Yes," she said again, and this time it was easier, because the second time she had already begun to believe it. The preacher came out on a Sunday, which was Sarah's day. Amos had insisted on that, because it was her day and it was right. There was no ceremony worth speaking of. A plain vow said in the kitchen with Clara sitting between them on the bench, holding both their hands, looking up from one face to the other with the gravity of someone bearing witness to something important. The preacher, a deacon named Fletcher who had kind eyes and no opinion about Sarah Blaine's looks or her worth, said the words, and they said theirs back, and that was the whole of it. Afterward, Clara said, "Now?" "Now," said Amos. Clara turned to Sarah and said, "Mama," in exactly the same voice she had been using to the wooden horse all along, matter of fact and decided, as though she were reporting a fact that had always been true and had simply been waiting for the adults to catch up to it. Sarah put her arm around the child and held her against her side, the small warm weight of her, the fist still curling into Sarah's sleeve, still holding on, and she looked at Amos over Clara's dark curls and found him already looking at her. That winter Amos built a second chair for the kitchen, not the practical ladder-back chairs already there, but a proper chair, a rocking chair, smooth-jointed and steady, with the same careful attention he had given the little blue chair in Clara's room. He set it by the fire and said nothing about it. and Sarah sat in it that evening and rocked Clara to sleep while the snow came down soft outside, and the ranch was warm and the fire did its steady, faithful work. She looked across the room at Amos, who was reading in the other chair, the lantern between them throwing gold on his hands and his face, and the edge of the book, and she thought about the flour cold against her palms that November morning in the boarding-house kitchen, and the knock at the door, and the small fist on the coat lapel, and all the strange paths that the heart makes through difficult country to find the place where it can rest. A home is built by axe. She had known that always, in a practical way, the way she knew how to mend a latch and stock a larder. What she had not known, or not trusted, was that those same axe, set end to end across a winter, could build something that lasted, something that held. Clara slept, the fire burned, the snow lay down its quiet on the Nevada hills. Friend, there is a truth as old as the frontier, and it is this: worth is not decided by a town. It never was. Sarah Blaine walked into a cold kitchen with a practical heart and roughened hands, and she fed a hungry child and repaired a broken latch and sat in a chair when someone offered it kindly. And that was all it took. Not beauty, not the town's approval, not a single soft word said at the right moment, just the honest daily work of showing up and doing what needed doing and letting the warmth come, slow and real, from the doing of it. Clara saw it first. Children usually do. If this story settled something in your heart tonight, leave us a comment and tell us, was there ever a moment when someone saw your worth before you saw it yourself? We'd love to hear it. And if you'd like more journeys like this one, more stories of ordinary people building extraordinary lives on the American frontier, please subscribe and come sit with us again. Good night. God bless you, and safe travels wherever the road takes you next.